Geopolitics with David.
If this happens, you won't feel it in the ice. You'll feel it in your wallet. Not because Greenland is some magic land of treasure, but because Trump gets Greenland isn't really about buying an island. It's about changing rules. It's about rewriting what's normal inside an alliance. And once you rewrite that, the bill doesn't get paid in nuke, it gets paid at home, quietly, through higher costs, higher risk, and a world that suddenly feels less predictable. And here's the open loop. The most brutal consequence won't be the headline you expect. It'll be the mechanism behind the headline, hidden, boring, and expensive. I'm Professor David O'Brien. I study how geopolitical shocks flow downhill into household costs: energy, shipping, borrowing, insurance, taxes, and the subtle price of uncertainty. This is educational content, not financial advice. Do your own research and consider professional guidance. Now, by the end, you will understand three things: what gets Greenland could realistically mean, the real mechanism that turns that move into higher costs, and what signals to watch next. Because this isn't a one-day story, it's a chain reaction. Here's the map, fast, in 4 pieces. 1. Sovereignty, what would have to happen legally and politically for Greenland to change hands, and why the just buy it version is mostly fantasy. 2. NATO, how a fight with an ally becomes an invisible tax on coordination, intelligence, and deterrence. 3. The Arctic missile problem, why the North is becoming a new highway for warning systems, surveillance, and routes. 4. Domestic costs, defense budgets, markets, risk premia, energy and transport, and the simple truth that uncertainty always shows up as higher prices. Keep those 4 in your head, because every argument you'll hear is just a remix of them. And the moment you see which piece is breaking, you'll know what happens next. Now let's define the phrase everyone throws around: Trump gets Greenland. In real life, there are only a few ways this could look. Scenario 1 is a consensual treaty-based transfer. Legally complex, politically explosive, and not something you can do with a handshake. Scenario 2 is a lease, a basing expansion, or an agreement that increases U.S. control without formal sovereignty, the "we don't own it, but we run key parts of it" model. Scenario 3 is coercion, tariffs, diplomatic threats, pressure campaigns, the kind of leverage that forces a small ally to choose between humiliation and pain. Scenario 4 is de facto control, the quietest one. America doesn't take Greenland on paper, but it locks up ports, minerals, infrastructure, and security dependencies over time until the island's strategic posture is functionally American. Here's the key: only one of these produces stable, long-term benefits. The others produce something else: resentment, hedging, and a precedent that makes the world more dangerous. And the moment that precedent exists, you don't control who copies it. To understand why, you have to step into the legal reality. Greenland is a self-governing territory within the Kingdom of Denmark. Greenland's autonomy is not a vibe or a political slogan. It's formalized in the self-government framework that recognizes Greenlanders as a people with the right to self-determination, and it's built on the idea of equality and mutual respect between Greenland's government and the Danish government. Denmark handles parts of foreign and security policy, but Greenland's own institutions are real and they matter, which means any attempt to go around Nuuk creates a legitimacy crisis. Any attempt to go around Copenhagen creates a sovereignty crisis inside the kingdom, and any attempt to force either one creates something bigger than a bilateral argument. It becomes an alliance crisis, because Denmark is a NATO member, and NATO is held together by consent and trust, not by conquest. So here's the blunt truth. If a US president tries to get Greenland through pressure, the legal fight becomes political, and the political fight becomes psychological. The question stops being, is this allowed? And becomes, are the rules still real? And when rules stop feeling real, everyone starts preparing for a world where the strong take what they can. Even if nothing is seized, the attempt alone can change behavior. That's the scary part. The action doesn't have to succeed to do damage. It just has to signal a new normal. Now, the strategic motive, the part that sounds convincing because some of it is. Greenland sits on geography that matters for early warning and space operations. The US operates Pituffik Space Base, formerly Thule Air Base, under a defense agreement with Denmark, and the base supports ballistic missile early warning and space surveillance functions. In plain English, it helps you see things coming. That matters more now, because the Arctic is becoming a busier corridor. Not because it's romantic, but because the North shortens distances, changes flight paths, shifts naval patterns, and forces militaries to think in colder, faster routes. The North is becoming a new highway, and highways attract traffic, commercial and military. So yes, there's logic in wanting more capability there. But capability is not the same as sovereignty. And the moment you jump from "we need access" to "we deserve ownership," you trigger the one problem that makes everything else more expensive. You fracture trust inside your own coalition. And that fracture is a multiplier. It doesn't just affect Greenland. It affects every table where allies share information, coordinate forces, and decide whether to take risk together. Here's the core mechanism explained in under 2 minutes with zero jargon. Think of NATO trust like a credit rating for the Western security system. When the rating is high, everything is cheaper. Intelligence gets shared faster, logistics get approved sooner, joint deterrence is clearer, markets assume stability, shipping insurers price lower risk, governments borrow with less fear. It's not magic, it's confidence. But when trust drops, the rating drops, and suddenly the same world costs more to run. You have to spend money to replace what trust used to do for free. You build redundancies. You deploy more forces just in case. You create parallel systems. You negotiate every detail. And the cost doesn't show up in one place. It shows up everywhere. So if the US starts treating an ally's territory like a negotiable asset under pressure, it tells every ally the rules inside the club are conditional, and conditional rules create conditional cooperation. Allies don't necessarily break away. They slow down, they hedge, they compartmentalize, they share less, they ask for more guarantees. And that slowing down is exactly what adversaries love, because it creates seams, gaps that can be tested. Now let's prove we're not guessing. We have real signals from public opinion and real-world politics. A Reuters Ipsos poll in mid-January 2026 found only about 17% of Americans approve of efforts to acquire Greenland, and large majorities worry it would damage NATO and US relations with European allies. That matters because it tells you something important. This is not a broadly supported national project, which means any hard push becomes a high volatility political fight at home too, and volatility is expensive. It raises the odds of sudden reversals, court fights, congressional resistance, and chaotic negotiations, exactly the kind of instability that makes allies hedge and markets reprice risk. And you can see the alliance reaction starting to harden because Denmark and European partners are treating Greenland's defense as a shared NATO concern, with discussions of stronger presence and coordinated posture. Whether every detail of that posture holds isn't the point. The point is that the issue is already being framed as alliance-wide, not bilateral. That is the opposite of what you want if your goal is a smooth, quiet expansion of access. Once it becomes a NATO stress test, every move gets interpreted politically. Now let's run the historical pattern. 3 short precedents, not because history repeats perfectly, but because it repeats mechanically. Example 1, the Suez Crisis in 1956. Britain and France assumed they could act like old empires and control a strategic corridor, and the United States, supposedly their partner, forced a reversal. The lesson wasn't who won. The lesson was that alliance trust is not guaranteed, and when a major power uses financial and political leverage inside a relationship, the other side remembers. Europe didn't immediately leave the Western camp, but it accelerated the desire for autonomy. The punchline that mirrors today is simple. Inside alliances, humiliation is never free. Example 2. The Iraq War split in 2003. The West didn't collapse, but the fracture mattered. It created years of distrust, reduced appetite for joint action, and reshaped how Europeans thought about US decision-making. The punchline that mirrors today. Even when you keep the alliance on paper, you can weaken it in practice, and weakening it in practice is what makes the world more expensive to police. Example 3, Crimea in 2014 and the broader lesson of territorial revisionism. Regardless of who you blame for what came before, the act of changing borders by force created a new era of sanctions, rearmament, and risk pricing across Europe. It didn't just shift a map, it shifted assumptions. And when assumptions shift, insurers, investors, and governments all start paying for a more dangerous baseline. The punchline that mirrors today. Once territorial pressure is normalized, the world starts charging you for instability. Now apply the pattern to today. Where are we in the cycle? We're in the signaling stage, where rhetoric and threats are testing boundaries, and everyone is watching whether institutions hold. The 3 signals that match this stage are clear. First, whether the US executive branch talks about Greenland as security access or as ownership. Ownership language is escalation because it reframes allies as obstacles. Second, whether Congress moves to restrain or enable any coercive path because war powers and funding become the real check. Reuters reporting indicates lawmakers have already moved diplomatically to reassure Denmark and Greenland, emphasizing congressional authority and alliance support. Third, whether NATO posture shifts from quiet coordination to public demonstration, because public demonstration usually means trust is under pressure. Now here's the next domino, the one people miss. If allies feel threatened, they don't just protest, they redesign dependency. They ask, how do we reduce exposure to American unpredictability? That can mean buying different defense systems, building more EU-centric command capacity, restricting certain basing permissions, or quietly changing how intelligence is shared. And once those changes begin, they're hard to reverse because they're justified as prudence. That's your mini cliffhanger. Even if the Greenland story fades from headlines, the structural changes can continue in silence. At this point, skeptics will say, this time is different. Europe needs America. NATO won't break. Maybe. But you don't need NATO to break for costs to rise. You only need NATO to become slower and more conditional. Another objection. The US can do what it wants. It's the superpower. That's the oldest trap in geopolitics, confusing capability with consequence. Great powers can do many things. The question is what price they pay after and whether the price is worth the gain. And the third objection, Greenland is strategic, so the strategy justifies it. Strategy doesn't justify destroying the system that makes strategy affordable. A radar site isn't worth a permanent discount in allied trust. Now let's talk about the domino effect globally, because this is where Greenland stops being a local story. If a major power pushes for territory because it's strategic, it creates a precedent that others can cite. It becomes a permission structure. You're not just arguing over one island, you're teaching the world a method. And once methods exist, they spread. Regional powers start looking at buffer zones, island chains, energy corridors, and ports with new appetite. Even if they don't invade, they pressure harder. They bargain with more threats, they militarize disputes faster, and the world becomes more brittle. A brittle world is a world where supply chains cost more, because supply chains run on insurance and predictability. A more brittle world raises shipping premiums, raises energy volatility, and increases the price of any good that travels across oceans, which is most of what you touch. That's why the cold open was true. You won't feel it in the ice, you'll feel it in the receipts. Now price the American cost directly. First, defense budget pressure. If the US pursues anything resembling sovereignty or long-term control expansion, the Arctic becomes a permanent logistics tax. Everything is farther, colder, harder to maintain. Building and sustaining infrastructure in extreme environments costs more than people assume, and it doesn't scale politely. Every extra unit of capability requires disproportionate support. Second, alliance premium. If trust drops, the US must substitute money for trust. More unilateral deployments, more redundancy, more stockpiles, more insurance forces positioned to cover what coalition friction now delays. Third, market and risk premia. When the world believes US policy is more volatile, especially toward allies, markets price more uncertainty. Uncertainty raises borrowing costs at the margin, and borrowing costs at the margin become real money when debt is large because small changes applied to huge numbers are huge. Let me convert that into an everyday picture. Imagine you're running a household with a mortgage, car payments, and insurance. If your credit profile worsens even slightly, you don't get one dramatic letter saying, "You're broke." You get a series of small hikes. A little more here, a little more there, you pay more for the same life. That's what policy volatility does to nations. It's not always a crash, it's often a slow leak. And slow leaks are brutal because people normalize them. Now we reach the part that decides whether this is a strategic upgrade or a long-term self-inflicted wound. The future branches. There are three. Future one is cooperation without sovereignty. This is the boring, stable path. The US expands access and capability through Denmark and Greenland in a way that respects autonomy and alliance norms. More investment around Pituffik, more joint surveillance, more Arctic infrastructure support, more economic agreements structured transparently. This path gives America what it actually needs, capability and access, without shattering trust. It also gives Denmark and Greenland leverage and reassurance, and it strengthens NATO in the Arctic rather than turning the Arctic into an alliance fracture line. In this future, the cost to Americans is limited because the trust credit rating stays high. Future 2 is chronic friction with Europe. In this world, the US keeps pushing rhetorically and politically, using leverage, threats, and public pressure. Europe responds with louder autonomy talk and quieter hedging. NATO remains alive but becomes slower and more conditional. Intelligence and logistics become more bureaucratic. Joint deterrence becomes less crisp. The US still expands its Arctic posture, but it pays an added premium to do it, because every negotiation now carries political risk. Markets price higher volatility. Defense budgets creep upward, and ordinary Americans feel it as a gradual rise in costs. Energy volatility, higher insurance and shipping impacts, and higher long-term government financing burdens. Nothing breaks in one day, which is why this is plausible. It's death by friction. Future 3 is the brutal one, alliance crisis plus accidental escalation. Not because the US invades Greenland. Public support for force appears extremely low, and that would be strategically catastrophic. The brutal scenario is where coercion and public humiliation degrade crisis management, and then a separate Arctic incident, an intercept, a naval shadowing, a misread exercise, spirals in a crowded environment with weakened trust. When trust is high, incidents are managed quietly. When trust is low, incidents become tests of resolve, and tests of resolve are where accidents happen. In this future, the United States ends up paying far more to maintain deterrence, because deterrence is now working against both adversaries and alliance skepticism. That's the nightmare. You spend more and get less. So what should you watch, the clock and the watch list, without sounding paranoid? Start with 3 categories of indicators. Indicator 1 is alliance stress signals. Watch for public statements that shift from shared security to fundamental disagreement. Watch for European military posture moves framed explicitly as NATO unity in the Arctic, and watch for any new restrictions, delays, or conditions around basing and joint operations. Those are the earliest signs the trust rating is dropping. Indicator 2 is legislative and institutional constraint. Watch Congress. If Congress moves to box in coercive options, that reduces volatility. If Congress fragments, that increases volatility. Reuters reporting shows lawmakers moving to reassure Denmark and Greenland and emphasize congressional war powers, signals of institutional resistance to escalation. The stronger the institutional constraint, the more likely we drift toward cooperation without sovereignty. Indicator 3 is market-based uncertainty. Watch long-dated borrowing costs, watch shipping insurance chatter around Arctic routes, watch energy transport volatility, and watch defense procurement headlines in Europe. You're not trying to time anything. You're trying to detect whether the baseline risk assumption has changed. The phase transition sign is when multiple indicators move together. Alliance stress rises, institutional constraint weakens, and markets begin pricing more volatility. That combination is when costs start compounding. Timeline? Near term is months. Rhetoric, diplomacy, congressional moves, and NATO posture statements. Midterm is 1 to 2 years, procurement decisions, basing agreements, and structural hedging behavior in Europe. Long term is several years. New alliance architectures, normalized coercion precedents, and permanently higher cost of maintaining deterrence. Direction matters more than exact timing. This is a confidence story, and confidence moves in waves. Now, practical protocol: how to turn fear into action without pretending you can control geopolitics. Step 1. Reduce concentration risk in your life. If your income and stability depend on one fragile channel, one client, one platform, one geography, your personal system is more vulnerable to volatility. Step 2. Protect liquidity and optionality. In uncertain periods, the people who can breathe are the people who can adapt without panic. Step 3. Think duration. The longer your commitments, the more vulnerable you are to sudden changes in rates and costs. Step 4. Build small resilience around energy and essentials. Nothing dramatic, just enough to reduce exposure to spikes and disruptions. Step 5. Invest in skills and mobility. Skills that travel, networks that travel, and the ability to pivot if the baseline changes. Step 6. Don't make the classic mistake. Don't panic and make irreversible decisions based on one headline. The point is not to live in fear. The point is to recognize that rule changes at the top create price changes at the bottom. Now we land this. Restate the mechanism in one sentence. When a superpower tries to rewrite territorial norms inside its own alliance, it damages trust, and damaged trust makes the entire security and economic system more expensive to operate. Restate the stage and the key risk. We're in the signaling stage, where rhetoric and leverage are testing institutions, and the key risk is not a dramatic takeover, it's the slow institutional and alliance friction that raises costs at home. And here's the hard line that matters. The question isn't whether you can take Greenland, it's what you break when you try. If you want a final image, picture the West as a bridge. It holds because the bolts, rules, and trust are tight. You can drive heavier trucks across it when you maintain it. But if you loosen the bolts to grab a trophy, you don't just endanger the far side. You weaken the bridge under your own feet, and you still have to cross it every day. One question before you go: what do you think is the real red line here? The idea of sovereignty or the act of coercion inside NATO? And if you disagree with my mechanism, tell me why. What do you think actually keeps costs low when alliances get stressed?